So, of course, one of the recent innovations in services negotiations that we've been hearing about is this Trade in International Services Agreement, or TISA. So this presentation will focus on that. And as has been mentioned, there are about 23 countries who are negotiating this TISA, when you count the EU as one. Most of them are developed countries. But I think Wamkele is right to be concerned that this could be brought into the WTO for all WTO members to comply with it, because just yesterday we heard the American Chamber of Commerce asking for best practices from free trade agreements, such as TISA perhaps, to be brought into the World Trade Organization. So what I'll be going through today is based on news reports, because of course TISA is being negotiated in secret. It's unclear to me why it's being negotiated in secret, since it's the same issues, services liberalisation, domestic regulations, disciplines and so on, that are being negotiated here at the WTO, where the negotiating text is released regularly, with all the brackets showing the areas that are not agreed. The Swiss government, though, did release their TISA proposals. So what is covered by the TISA? Well, it seems that the European Union is trying to keep the TISA rules to be mostly like the WTO rules on services, which would mean that most public services are covered by the TISA, as Scott explained. But what might be different is that the TISA may be strictly binding on state and local governments, unlike at the WTO, because this would come from a US free trade agreement which has this kind of approach, and of course the United States is in TISA, so can be expected to push their standard model in their free trade agreements. Because of course at the WTO, governments only have to take reasonable measures that are available to it to ensure that their state and local governments comply. You just have to try and make them comply. But in a US free trade agreement, and perhaps therefore the TISA, state and local governments are strictly bound by all the obligations. No excuses, no exceptions, unless non-conforming measures, which we can talk about. So how much liberalisation are governments likely to have to do in the TISA? Presumably it will be more than they have done at the World Trade Organization. For example, the US ambassador to the WTO said that they are looking at a highest common denominator approach. So all the TISA countries go up to the highest level of liberalisation, presumably at the WTO or elsewhere, of any member country. So you all go up to the most extreme level of liberalisation. And of course, the model of liberalisation in the TISA has been reported to be positive list basis for market access. So the same as at the WTO, you list the sectors you want to open to foreign service companies. But negative list for national treatment, or top-down, as Scott said, which means that you have to treat foreign service companies the same as your own in all sectors, unless you list it as an exception right here, right now in the negotiations, and all the other TISA countries agree to give you that exception. So that, of course, means that for all new sectors, like fracking or some of the IT sectors, they are automatically open to foreign companies, automatically have to give national treatment, if you have local companies doing it. So, of course, if you have national treatment in all the sectors, except those where you get an agreed exception, that means that you cannot require technology transfer, you cannot require training of locals, you cannot require employment of locals, including on boards of directors, unless you get a negotiated exception that they all agree to. And for those of you from oil-producing countries, there are serious problems that you need to avoid in the negative list national treatment, which a number of oil-producing countries have already experienced. And for example, Verizon has said they want to see the elimination of restrictions on foreign equity in telecoms in TISA. But it doesn't stop there. The European Union in TISA has apparently proposed, even though it's positive list on market access, they want extreme negative list liberalisation in some aspects of market access. For example, joint venture requirements, banned, unless you negotiate exceptions for up to 10% of all the 155 sectors at the WTO. And an even more extreme than negative list requirement in the banning of all economic needs tests. Full stop, never have them in any sector, ever, remove them all, never have them in future. So this goes way beyond negative list in market access, despite TISA being positive list for market access. That's the European Union proposal. It also bans performance requirements and various other things. In terms of state-owned enterprises, the US may propose disciplines on that in TISA, which may be an attempt to attack Japan Post, again, since Japan is in TISA, and with China planning to join TISA, this would presumably be difficult for them to accept. UPS, the US postal company, has said they're concerned by state-owned postal services in other TISA countries, and they want this addressed in the TISA. So you can see state-owned enterprises may be covered. Then we come to the hot topic of the day, which is the US government's ability to spy on our communications and emails, as revealed by Edward Snowden. And the US in TISA will be proposing that computer servers can be located, you cannot require them to be in your country. So they could be in the US, extra easy for the US government to continue reading your emails and accessing your financial transactions as they have been doing. So Verizon again has said they don't want privacy to stop free flow of information. Please carry on with the current practices, according to Verizon. Then we come to the sectoral proposals. There are proposals on information and communication technology, environmental services, professional services, maritime services, and these are the ones that we know about from news reports. And there is a proposal on financial services. So it's unclear what will be in that. At least I don't know of a leak or a public report of what's in there, but it may be based on the financial services understanding, which is optional here at the WTO. In the WTO, only 33 countries have joined this financial services understanding, and almost all of them are developed countries. In the financial services understanding, it has things like a standstill. So you cannot have any extra exceptions beyond what you currently do. You have to try to eliminate or reduce your monopolies in financial services. You have to open the government procurement of financial services by all your public entities, perhaps even including some state-owned enterprises, with no minimum threshold contract value, even the small $1 contracts, whereas under the optional government procurement agreement at the WTO, you only open the procurement of the ministries listed and you negotiate, and it's only contracts above a threshold value of, say, $200,000. But in the financial services understanding of the WTO, which may be incorporated into the TISA, it's all financial services procurement by all public entities with no minimum threshold contract value. It also, in the WTO's optional financial services understanding, has negative list market access for Mode 3, the right of foreign banks to come in, unless you get an agreed exception, and you have to allow new financial services, i.e. the complex derivatives that cause the current financial crisis. Now, this may be moderated by, say, the safeguard in US free trade agreements, which says you can require an authorization and you can refuse that for prudential reasons, but we'll discuss the prudential defense and how far that goes in a minute. Then we come to the proposal on domestic regulations disciplines by countries like Hong Kong, New Zealand, and Switzerland, which are famous for, at the WTO, being the most extreme disciplinarians on your ability to regulate in the equivalent negotiations here in the WTO. So even if this was based on copying and pasting the current chair's text in domestic regulations disciplines negotiations here at the WTO, which has not been concluded, into the TISA, it would mean, for example, your domestic regulations in sectors, perhaps including financial services, must be pre-established. So, can you do new financial re-regulation as widely recommended after this financial crisis? For example, to ban naked short selling, as a number of TISA developed countries have done in this financial crisis. Your regulations must be based on objective and transparent criteria, which can mean you must have flexibility, so no maximum price on electricity or healthcare, but to be transparent, you can't have discretion. So it's unclear to me how you satisfy the requirement to be flexible and inflexible. Presumably the answer is you don't regulate. And your regulations must be relevant. So, for example, a requirement for banks to lend a certain amount to small farmers or small and medium enterprises may not be permitted because it's not relevant. So, of course, these three countries have also proposed at the WTO, or two of them have proposed, a necessity test on regulations of services, which is very difficult to pass, and countries even like Brazil, Canada, and the US have concerns about this. And the US concerns are, of course, because of the pressure from their state and local governments who actually want to be able to regulate. So how would this be enforced? Well, the Swiss proposal says that the TISA would be enforced through the state-to-state dispute settlement like at the WTO, including with non-violation complaints. So even when you comply with all the requirements of the TISA, there's another layer of benefits that the other country reasonably expected to get that you have nullified or impaired. You can be sued, you lose, and your benefits are removed under the TISA provisions. So, what are the implications of these provisions for financial crises? Well, financial crises, of course, are serious and happen often. We're currently living through one. You know the impact it's had in your country, including on employment. For example, Indonesia and Thailand in the 1997 financial crisis had an output loss of 40% of their gross domestic product, 40. According to the eminent economist Rogoff, he said that you can expect at least 5 years of employment and output loss after a financial crisis. Your government debt increases by an average of 86%. He also said that periods of high international capital mobility have repeatedly produced international banking crises. And in 18 out of 26 banking crises, the financial sector had been liberalised in the previous 5 years. Even the Bank for International Settlements, the principal centre for international central bank cooperation, said that regulated environments are less prone to the huge cyclical swings we see in today's liberalised environment. So, of course, one way to deal with these kinds of things is through capital management techniques or capital controls. And, of course, countries like the United States effectively used capital controls in the 1960s. Iceland has used them in this financial crisis. Malaysia used them in the 1997 financial crisis. And even the International Monetary Fund is recommending them in certain situations. So what would TISA do to your ability to have capital controls? If they just copy and paste the WTO rules on movement of capital into the TISA, that of course requires movement of capital if it's part of a market access commitment in Mode 1 or in Mode 3. But under the WTO rules, you can have capital restrictions if the IMF requests it, which they have never done, or under Article 12 of the GATS WTO rules, which then sets a whole lot of substantive and procedural restrictions on your ability to use it, or possibly under the prudential defence. But in the prudential defence, of course, famously, there's that last sentence that some experts think cancel it out because it says you can't use it as a means of avoiding your obligations. Some experts also say the prudential defence cannot be used for capital controls, and a US insurance company has already said that this prudential defence should be weakened in the TISA. They don't even want it to be as strong as the one that's in the WTO. But even if you copy and paste those safeguards from GATS into the TISA, rather than say that total ban on effective capital controls that's in a US free trade agreement, even if you have the GATS safeguards, because TISA is going to have more market access for foreign service companies, then you have more foreign investors in your country who want to send their profits home. So any liability you have under existing investment chapters of free trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties that completely ban capital controls and may be enforced by investor-to-state dispute settlement increases, because now you have more foreign investors who can sue under your other treaties. And this is not a hypothetical thing. 95 countries have already been sued under this kind of investor-to-state dispute settlement that was mentioned, and both developed and developing countries have lost cases. And of course, under these bilateral investment treaty and free trade agreement investment chapter cases, they reward the foreign investors who break the law. You still have to pay them. So of course, recently there was a recent case where the government had to pay the investor who broke the law $1.8 billion in damages, plus compound interest, takes it to $2.3 billion. Of course, the interest can be at commercial interest rates, compounded monthly from the date of the government measure, so it adds up to be more than your damages. And of course, these tribunals that the investors can sue at have insufficient conflict of interest rules. One of the 3 judges, this actually happened, can be on the board of directors of the parent company of the investor bringing the case. No need to disclose, no need to withdraw. The investor wins. On appeal, the investor still wins. Same judge goes on to do the same thing in another case, also no problem, under the ICSID rules at the World Bank. And of course, the hedge funds are now investing in these cases and the lawyers are ambulance chasing, so the number of cases goes up like this. And we've seen these cases have been filed as a result of financial crises. Argentina had their huge financial crisis in 2001, and they've been sued under more than 46 cases for more than $17 billion. The failure to bail out the banks equally in this current financial crisis has already resulted in governments being liable, and Cyprus and Greece have already been sued under their bilateral investment treaties for the measures they've taken to deal with this financial crisis, including the haircut that Cyprus had to impose in March this year as a result of the European Union requirements. So even though TISA may just copy and paste the GATS rules, You have to think about your existing liability under your existing other treaties, whether they're bilateral investment treaties or free trade agreement investment chapters. Thank you.